Voice of Geekdom is on Patreon. Your support is vital to keeping this channel running and creating new content. Hello Tolkien geeks. Today we take a look at the life and times of the King of the Woodland Realm and father of Legolas, King Thranduil. Thranduil was a character who was created for The Hobbit, where he was known simply as the Elven-King. Tolkien gave him a name and worked out his history and backstory later on, during the drafting for The Lord of the Rings and its appendices, and also in other posthumously published writings. Thranduil's father, according to unfinished tales, was Oropher of Doriath. Oropher was presumably one of those Sindar who were exiled after the ruin of Doriath, also known as the Second Kinslaying, in the year 506 of the First Age, and then fled to the havens of Sirion with the other exiles of that realm. Later, Oropher arrived in Lindon in the early Second Age, before migrating eastwards before the rise of Sauron at some unknown point in the first millennium, and in the year 750 of the Second Age, he was taken by the Silvan Elves of the Greenwood as their king. Oropher was killed in the War of the Last Alliance. The forces of the Silvan Elves from Greenwood and Lorien refused to submit to the leadership of the Noldor king Gil-galad during the Last Alliance of Elves and Men, perhaps holding on to old grievances between the Sindar and the Noldor from the First Age, when there was much strife between Thingol's Doriath and the Noldor exiles. In the Battle of Dagorlad in 3434 of the Second Age, a lack of discipline cost the Silvan Elves of Mirkwood and Lothlorien dearly when their army recklessly charged before the allied forces were ready. Oropher's elves were driven into the area which later became known as the Dead Marshes, and there he perished, along with Amdir, the king of Lorien. After the defeat of Sauron, 7 years later, Thranduil led the survivors of the Silvan host back north and was crowned as king. Greenwood the Great and the Woodland Realm were a part of the greater community in the highly metropolitan region of Rhovanion. Their neighbours included the Elves of Lothlorien, at that time known as Lorinand in the Silvan tongue. In the north dwelt a colony of the dwarves of Durin's folk. The Iron Hills, according to some sources, were occupied from some time during the First Age. Later, of course, after the fall of Moria, the exiled dwarves of Khazad-dûm migrated to and inhabited the lonely mountain, Erebor. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm were responsible for the dwarf road which ran through Greenwood, which facilitated trade between the various peoples of that area. There were also middlemen who lived there, the Northmen, who were the ancestors of 3 of the factions of men that we meet in the later Third Age in the books, most notably the Rohirrim, but also the Beornings and the men of Lake Town. Also nearby were the Hobbits, who in the early Third Age resided in the Vales of the Anduin, though they avoided interaction with the other peoples of the area, and their settlements at that time weren't recorded by history. We learn about this in The Lord of the Rings through the story of Smeagol, of course. In the early centuries of the Third Age, with their population diminished by heavy losses in the War of the Last Alliance, Thranduil's people abandoned the southern part of the forest, including Amon Lanc, the Naked Hill, which had been Oropher's capital in the Second Age. The south of the forest grew wild and dangerous, with creatures including the giant spiders moving in, the offspring of Shelob, the last surviving daughter of Ungoliant. Sometime between the year 1050 and 1100, Sauron, who had by now returned once again in his guise as the Necromancer, took over the abandoned fortress at Amon Lanc, building on top of it, at which time it became known as Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery. The Elves of Mirkwood established their new settlement near the river, in vast underground caverns behind great stone doors, which was said by many to have been built to emulate the halls of Menegroth in Doriath, Thingol's subterranean palace from the Quenta Silmarillion. Eventually, the forest was renamed to Mirkwood, and travellers avoided entering. The building of Dol Guldur and the coming of Sauron meant that the Dwarf Road was abandoned, and a new, less well-maintained path was built further north. Trade between the Woodland Realm, Erebor, and Esgaroth rapidly diminished. The situation in the region became even more unstable after the coming of Smaug in 2770, but then the wizard Gandalf organised the quest of Erebor, and the region changed again. In Third Age 2941, Thranduil and some of his household were holding a feast in the woods when they were repeatedly interrupted by Thorin's company, who were lost and starving. Thranduil saw the intrusion of the dwarves as provocative and took them prisoner. Thorin Oakenshield refused to reveal the purpose of the dwarves' journey, and old rivalries between dwarf and elf led to a nasty standoff and a prolonged period of captivity for the dwarves, before they were rescued by the resourceful professional burglar, Bilbo Baggins, with the aid of his magic ring. Following the escape of the dwarves, Thranduil's wood elves, who had encountered Bilbo and the dwarves at Laketown, travelled back up the river and carried word of their escape to the king, even as Thorin's company negotiated with the Master of Laketown and prepared to continue on to the Lonely Mountain. The king knew now the dwarves' errand, or thought he did, and he said to himself, "Very well, we'll see. No treasure will come back through Mirkwood without my having something to say in the matter, but I expect they will all come to a bad end, and serve them right." He, at any rate, did not believe in dwarves fighting and killing dragons like Smaug, and he strongly suspected attempted burglary, or something like it, which shows he was a wise elf, and wiser than the men of the town, though not quite right, as we shall see in the end. Thranduil has a low opinion of dwarves and doesn't think they're brave enough to face Smaug. And he's not wrong. The dwarves are in fact rather cowardly in the book, and that large battle with Smaug that we saw at the end of the second Peter Jackson Hobbit movie never happened in the book. After the dragon had been slain by Bard of Laketown, Thranduil sets out with a host of wood elves, and, along with Bard and the lake men, besieges the mountain, which had been occupied by Thorin and the dwarves, and demands a share of the treasure hoard. Thranduil may have been a wise elf when it comes to sizing up the plans and intentions of the dwarves, but he certainly has his flaws as well. Back when Thorin was first captured by the Wood Elves, the narrator tells us a little about Thranduil, and opines about his fondness for wealth. In ancient days, the elves had had wars with some of the dwarves, whom they accused of stealing their treasure. It is only fair to say that the dwarves gave a different account, and said that they only took what was their due, for the Elf-King had bargained with them to shape his raw gold and silver, and had afterwards refused to give them their pay. If the Elf-King had a weakness, it was for treasure, especially for silver and white gems, and though his hoard was rich, he was ever eager for more, since he had not yet as great a treasure as other elf lords of old. Here in this passage, the narrator even very subtly alludes to the story of Thingol and the Nauglamir. That was the necklace of the dwarves, for which Thingol was killed by the dwarves of Nogrod in the Silmarillion. Those of you who are familiar with Tolkien's Silmarillion material may notice that many of the features of the world of the Hobbit are familiar. The Elven-King's halls, with their resemblance to Menegroth, the Dwarf Road through Rhovanion, which was reminiscent of the Dwarf Road in Beleriand, and even Thranduil himself. But Thranduil was an intriguing character before Tolkien ever fleshed him out, when he didn't have a name, and was still just called the Elven-King. And he's quite different to Thingol too. The similarities are subtle enough that these characters could easily be made to fit side by side in the same mythology. Before the Battle of Five Armies begins, Bilbo sneaks down to the Elvish camp and presents the Arkenstone of the Lonely Mountain to Thranduil and Bard to use for bargaining power against Thorin. Bilbo's benevolent betrayal of Thorin was designed to save the newly crowned king under the mountain from himself. Thranduil reacts with surprise and lauds Bilbo's decision. In fact, he tells the Hobbit, "Bilbo Baggins, you are more worthy to wear the armour of elf princes than many that have looked more comely in it." A little bit of a backhanded compliment here from the Elven-King, but perhaps you could say that he means well. Even Bilbo says himself that he feels ridiculous wearing his mithril coat. In the negotiations that followed, Thranduil takes full advantage of Bilbo's gambit, and Thorin agrees to give up 1/14th share of the dragon's hoard. Right before Dain Ironfoot shows up, and Thorin swiftly changes his mind again. With the tension now about to boil over in spite of Bilbo's efforts, the situation changes again when Bolg's army arrives, and the goblins provide a common enemy for the dwarves, men and elves to unite against. In the battle, Thranduil's host was positioned on the southernmost side of the mountain, and they were the first to charge the hated goblins. After the battle is won, Thranduil is left to settle matters with Dain, who honours the 1/14th share to Bard the Bowman agreed by Thorin, who of course died in the battle. Bard in turn gifts to Thranduil the Emeralds of Girion. That's Girion, who was Bard's own ancestor. These emeralds are his birthright. This gesture seems to placate Thranduil, who backs down from making any further demands of the dwarves, perhaps finally shamed by Bilbo's actions before the battle, and the closeness with which they all came to disaster. During at least the next couple of decades, a brief period of peace and prosperity blossomed with the death of Smaug, and also as a consequence to the White Council driving Sauron from Dol Guldur earlier that same year. It's unclear whether Thranduil was considered a member of the council himself, but as he's never mentioned with respect to their dealings, it seems unlikely that he was a fully fledged member or attended meetings. And Gandalf never takes him into his confidence during his later search for answers about Bilbo's ring, despite passing through Mirkwood during this period. Thranduil is not considered among the very wise, and his power is less than that of, say, Elrond. In the years leading up to the War of the Ring, and to the quest of Mount Doom, Mirkwood had once again become a dangerous and evil place. Dol Guldur was inhabited by the Ringwraiths prior to the war. Sauron sent Khamûl the Easterling and 2 other wraiths to occupy his former stronghold. Actually, the first we hear of the Mirkwood front to the war in The Lord of the Rings itself was before the full outbreak of war, during the Council of Elrond, when Legolas reports on the escape of Gollum. When Gandalf was investigating the ring with the aid of Aragorn, Thranduil's folk were given the task of holding him prisoner after Gandalf interrogates him. According to Legolas, Gollum escaped his father's halls when marauding orcs from Dol Guldur attacked. Towards the end of the war, on March the 15th, which was the same day that the Battle of the Pelennor Fields ended, Dol Guldur launched simultaneous assaults on both Lothlorien and the Woodland Realm. The battle in Mirkwood was known as the Battle Under the Trees. After the Silvan Elves of the Woodland Realm fend off the assault, and Lorien defeats one further attack, 3 days after the destruction of the ring, a host of the Galathrim of Lothlorien, led by Lord Celeborn, march on Dol Guldur, and Lady Galadriel finally tears down the walls of the fortress with her magic. In the aftermath of the fighting, Thranduil and Celeborn meet in the forest on Elvish New Year, which is celebrated on the first day of spring, to discuss the future of the region. Mirkwood was formerly renamed to Erin Las Garlan, which is Wood of Green Leaves. In the Fourth Age, finally free of the persistent corruption of Sauron emanating from Dol Guldur, the elven kingdoms of the north once again prospered for a brief time. Thranduil ruled everything north of the mountains, while the Beornings and Woodmen took the territory south of the mountains, up to and including the Narrows, where the East Bight made the forest less wide to travel through. The southernmost region of the forest, the part surrounding Amon Lanc, was ruled by Celeborn and renamed to East Lorien. With the Free Peoples rebuilding after the downfall of Sauron, and Aragorn on the throne of the reunited kingdom, Legolas brings elvish craftspeople south to dwell in Ithilien, in northeast Gondor, the land granted to Prince Faramir after the war, and the Elves of the Greenwood restored that land, returning it to its former beauty, and they combined their labour with Gimli and his dwarfs to rebuild Minas Tirith. Ultimately though, the Elves of Middle-earth were destined to depart into the west, never to return, or to fade into disembodied spirits of nature. The Fourth Age was the dominion of men, who surely took over stewardship of the forests of the north over time. As for Thranduil himself, his final fate is ultimately unknown, but one would naturally assume that he would have gone into the west. We do know that his son Legolas sailed in the year 120 of the Fourth Age with his friend Gimli the dwarf. Perhaps Thranduil too was on that same boat.
And my axe.
Thank you to my Axe tier Patreon supporters. Erin M, Stephen Stark the Maya from Here Be Dragons, Kelly the Jaded Shipwright, Alexander Petrov, Joshua Boniface, and our newest axe wielder, A.N. Kreutzberg.